In this episode, Vincent and I talk about Spinoza's work on called The Ethics. It's a work that describes and makes the claim that there is only one thing that exists. He calls that a substance. And a substance is a thing that cannot help but existing. It exists necessarily. And all things that exist in the natural world, like tables, chairs, and human beings, are just instantiations of different modes of this substance existence. In this conversation, we flesh out what exactly this means and the kinds of attributes that this substance, which Spinoza refers to as God, is. We answer the question of how effective propositional arguments, like arguments such that if S then T, S therefore T, whether or not these are effective in helping us come to certain conclusions in a way that benefits our ordinary experience. We also round up with a rather special idea that one, at least one reading of Spinoza's work is that we are all interconnected in a way that is special, insofar as we're different manifestations of the one true thing that exists, the substance, the thing that Spinoza calls God. So I enjoy. I hope you have a great listen. Okay, welcome, Vincent. Welcome back. It's good to have you. I'm excited to speak to you today about one of your own favorite philosophers, Baruch Spinoza. I'm just going to get into it. Spinoza makes this rather radical claim. He claims that um, there is only one thing that exists that can explain all things. He calls this a substance. Um, what is a substance, and why can't there be more than one of it?
Yeah, in the most straightforward terms, a substance, in the tradition that Spinoza is coming from, we will use the term substance to describe something that exists independently of anything, right? So normally, right, before Spinoza comes into the picture, we think of individual items as substances, right? So for instance, a piece of candle, that would be a substance, right? And it will have all sorts of properties or modes, there are different ways of kind of hashing out like qualities. Right. The temperature, the temperature of the candle, the shape of the candle, the color of the candle, those things can change, right? But we kind of want to say, well, there's something underneath that doesn't change, right? All those properties depend on the substance. That is the substance of candle. Everything else is just dependent, right? They do exist, they are real, but they exist in this kind of dependent manner. Now you can say the same thing about all sorts of entities. Right? Spinoza takes that language and he updates it. So instead of saying that, pieces like a candle, something like a candle or a human being is a substance, he's going to say that there is just one substance that he calls God or nature. He uses the terms interchangeably. Everything else, right, we're just like properties. We're just like ways of being. All of our existence, the candle, me, my mind, the table, the chair, all of that depends on the existence of substance, God or nature, right? Just like how we formerly thought that the temperature of a candle depended on that of a candle, the candle itself. So he's kind of doing that really radical move. So all of us are just part of this one thing. All of us are just properties or qualities of this one thing.
Right. This sounds a lot like I don't know, the paradox of the statue and the clay, where the statue is just conceived as a notional object, and what really exists is the clay that can be modeled into statue parts and whatnot. I just find the view, I mean, I find his work really exciting, and
Mhm.
it speaks a lot to the way I think philosophy ought to be done, at least how I
Mhm.
thought philosophy ought to be done. But the move here is weird because we are saying that, well, a substance is the most fundamental thing that exists. It cannot have been conceived by anything else. For example, we might, and you brought the example of a candle. I
Mhm.
might just update that with our current understanding of science or maybe physics in particular and say that, well, we know what the kinds of fundamental particles, at least as far as our knowledge
Mhm.
goes, are. Maybe quarks, bosons, muons, and whatnot. These things seem to have finite properties, and it doesn't see, we can call them the most fundamental things because you can just describe
Mhm.
them as things that just are and are not contingent on any other thing. That's exactly what it means to be fundamental.
Yeah.
But yet Spinoza wants to make this metaphysical move and call this most fundamental thing God, when I don't think he needs to do that. Why can't he just stop at the level of quarks, bosons, muons, and whatnot?
Good. Yeah, I think that's a very kind of natural intuition to have, right? To kind of compare what is the picture that is giving to kind of our contemporary picture. I think, there are kind of real tensions there. I'm not an expert in the other side of things, the scientific picture side of things, but even though it looks like we have quite a good understanding of what exists fundamentally, the bosons, the quarks, all they have their spin properties and so on. Um, it's not clear really that that's the most fundamental level at all. Um, people used to think that atoms were the stopping point. Atoms literally meant indivisible. And then slowly we started realizing that they were divisible. So we had to we had to come with stuff like subatomic particles. And so I want to say, at least there is some open question as to what exists fundamentally. And once you get into the realm of trying to connect up, general relativity and quantum mechanics, there are all sorts of weird theories floating around. Some people genuinely think that there is kind of one thing that exists at bottom.
Right.
It's not going to be anything that we kind of recognize as a thing, of like something we can just point to and carve up like that. But maybe there's something like that. Why Spinoza chose to do that is kind of interesting. I think, there is a sense in which everything kind of depends on something else for its existence. I think that maybe is not too controversial, right? The fact that there is nothing that exists self-sufficiently, right? There's nothing that actually exists independently. Then we're just gonna ask, then what do they depend on? And you can ask that question, and you're gonna realize you don't have a very good answer for that. Right? Either there are two directions to go. Either the only things that exist are the smallest things, like atoms or subatomic particles, whatever they are. The infinitely many small things just jumbled up together, arranged together. Or there's just one big thing. And everything is just a modification of that property of them. Right? There are kind of two directions you can go. And I think Spinoza has various reasons why he goes towards that.
Right. I just realized that I wanted to backtrack and ask you why it is that you like Spinoza in the first place. I'm interested in knowing why that
Hmm.
is.
Yeah, I didn't follow, for Spinoza at first sight. It took a while. So I was first introduced to Spinoza in a political philosophy course, actually. Political philosophy of Spinoza and Hobbes. You can look at both. And I realized that at that time, I didn't quite like political philosophy. But there were sections of the course where we read stuff from Spinoza's metaphysics. Stuff about what he said about good and evil, what he said about the free will of human beings. And those things kind of drew my attention, and I started to read those texts. They were outside of the course. Um, Now I have a better appreciation for the political stuff, but back then when I was first exposed to it, I really didn't like it. And I was much more drawn to just like a few of his works. And now I think, Spinoza just really has this spirit of biting the bullet on certain radical conclusions, which is very nice to see. He doesn't really, mince his words, I think.
Right. No, I understand that intuition a lot. I find myself saying that every time I refuse to buy the bullet, I wonder if it's because of fear of going where the deduction follows, or whether it's just an intuition that something might be wrong with the kind of argumentation I have.
Hmm.
But if we shift back to the substance thing that we're talking about right now, Spinoza characterizes the substance as something that has infinite attributes necessarily, infinite attributes, infinite essence, and whatnot. I wonder why do we have to bake this in? Because it seems that we could talk of quarks if they are the most fundamental thing.
Hmm.
Let's grant that
Yeah.
that's the case for the sake of this argument. We could grant that they are the most fundamental thing and yet admit
Hmm.
that they are finite in every sense. They have specific properties, like you mentioned, the spin and mass and what and charge and whatnot. Yeah, they need not have infinite attributes as Spinoza proclaims to be
Yeah.
considered fundamental. Why does he need this for his argument?
Good, right? So we kind of have to be careful. He doesn't quite bake in all the infinite stuff into
Mm.
the definition of substance. It's something that he shows later. But he does kind of define God. For to begin with, he does define God as that which has all of these infinite characteristics. Whatever his essence is of God, right? God's essence must be infinite in whatever ways, in infinitely many ways, whatever you can think of. And then the substance has its own definition, which is whatever that kind of exists independently is the cause of itself. So the way he links those two together, that comes later. Right? He has kind of a long, complicated argument leading to that conclusion. Why he thinks so? Well, he has kind of a general suspicion about the way we make distinctions. So, how do we make distinctions between your body and my body? essentially. Right? We just have different dimensions. We are located in different places. But all of that doesn't really speak to you as you or me as me. Right? That's just dimensions. It's just a bunch of atoms being put together. In that sense, we don't really get distinction of real entity according to Spinoza. Right? We're just distinguishing between things that have similar properties. And he thinks you can do this for subatomic particles as well. So the example that he uses at one point is like a sample of water or body of water. When you split it up, so to speak, right? You can, right? You can indeed separate it. But he wants to say, well, you separate it insofar as they're just two of the same things. They are still just two spatial things, two extended things, right? You've not really done anything else beyond that. You have not really shown that one is something that exists independently of another. That's not the conclusion he showed.
I
Yeah,
see.
that's going to be his general strategy. Yeah.
Right. Well, so if let me see if I understand what this point is exactly saying that, well, you could try to piece out different things by their dimensions and set
Mhm.
properties, but that doesn't capture its essence. Is that what he's trying to say here?
Yeah, that's part of it. It's kind of like, how do you distinguish you or me? Well, that's just the same thing as trying to distinguish two parts of a sample of water.
Ah, I see. I see.
Yeah, just sorry, I might have, yeah, that was kind of the connection I was trying to draw. So that
Right.
kind of distinction, you can make that kind of distinction. We do make that kind of distinction. But that kind of distinction doesn't actually correspond to anything real. They're just kind of relative, much more secondary kind of distinction. They're not getting at the heart of what this thing actually is.
So his next conclusion would be that like all things are just modes or different instantiations of one true thing. Is
Yeah.
that
So every single thing, let's say every physical thing that exists in the universe, right? They're all just kind of modifications of the one thing underlying it.
right? But what does it mean? What does it mean when he says something like an infinite essence or infinite attributes? I don't, I mean, I understand the words that comprise
Yeah.
phrase, but I don't understand what it truly means.
Yeah, that can be a little opaque. I can try to help, and then you can let me know how helpful it is. When it talks about things like essence, or nature, they're the same thing, right? It is a term that's borrowed from earlier thinkers, right? Really, when we ask what's the essence or what's the nature of something, we're just asking what is it to be that thing, right? In the most stripped down sense. Right? What is it to be a candle? What is it to be me? What is it to be God? And God, you can for now can treat it as a placeholder, right? But wherever this God is, or you can just call it X, right? Wherever this X is, right? This X has an infinite number of properties. Anything that you can imagine, it just has everything, right? That's what it means to be. That's traditionally what we hope to see when we're talking about God. Whatever God is, He should have everything, right? In the most absolute, most infinite sense, right? When He gives that definition, He's not saying yet God does exist. He's just saying, if God is like that, if God does exist, this is how He ought to be defined.
Mm,
Or whatever, if you're not comfortable with the word God, whatever this thing is, infinite being, it has to be defined like that. Nobody else is gonna agree on any other definition, at least according to him. If you come up with a definition of God that doesn't involve um, perfection, infinite perfection of all his attributes, people are gonna say, yeah, that doesn't really sound like God. And then the proof for the existence of God comes much later.
right. But there's a distinction here. You mentioned that, well, if we want to conceive of a God, we must conceive of one that has perfection of his attributes, if he
Yeah.
does exist. This is different from saying that he must have all possible attributes or infinitely many attributes, because it seems to me that it could possibly be the case that if this God, I know Spinoza's God is not a personal God, it's not one that has
Hmm.
properties
Yeah.
in the traditional sense. But if he was to say that, well, this God ought to have perfection in his attributes, for example, goodness or creativity in
Yeah. Yeah.
sense, it seems like non-creativity or
Yeah.
just chaos is some other attribute that one could plausibly hold
Hmm.
out of the infinite attributes that a being can comprise. They
Hmm.
see that there's some attribute that would necessarily be contradictory or clash heads each other in such a way that we cannot optimally find a way that balances all of these.
Yeah.
How would
Yeah.
Spinoza go about this problem?
Yeah, good. That's a nice problem. So unfortunately, even though he does talk about God as consisting in an infinite number of attributes, he really gives us two, right? And those two are going to be extension and thought. So there is, God in a sense of a physical thing. All extended things kind of like are caused by that side of God or are derived from that side of God. And all of mental reality or ideas, thoughts, feelings, all those are going to come from the mental side, right? The mental attribute of God. He doesn't say anything at all about anything past these two attributes. But he says that must be more than just these two attributes, even though we are only talking about these two. Right?
Right.
If there are only two, if God only has two or some finite number of attributes, we just have the same problem. Like what is this being? Maybe this being does exist, but it's not infinite.
Mm.
So that's kind of the claim that he's making. It doesn't mean that we can know all infinite attributes. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what infinite understanding or understanding of infinite object looks like. But in principle, that's what he wants to say. So
Right.
that's the first thing. The second thing is interesting. So we have an idea of what two attributes are. Why aren't some other things attributes? Uh, Omnibenevolence is one that you often seen, right? Goodness of God. That's not one of it for Spinoza, right? For Spinoza, here's a different story about virtues, about morals, about such categories. He thinks those are very much derived from us and from our finite perspective. Right? They're human made, to put it kind of very simply, but they're socially and psychologically constructed. They're not in substance itself. They're not in reality itself. But we just see reality as consisting in this property, this moral property. Creativity is an interesting one. I'm not sure, what you say about that. But God does create. This God does create, not in the sense of like, God created the world in 6 days and left it alone, only to intervene every now and then after. That's not the kind of God, or that's not the kind of creation story that Spinoza has in mind. Spinoza's God has a different kind of creation story, which consists in everything that exists, everything that happens, insofar as we are properties of God, that's the creative activity of God. Everything that is happening, has happened and will happen, that's God's creation, in action, basically. That's
Right.
what he thinks. Right. So it's not kind of a one-off event.
Uh-huh. But would he bite the bullet in the fact that, well, if he's saying that everything that exists is just different modes of God's infinite attributes, what about all of the bad things that exist in the world?
Mm-hmm.
Tornadoes, tsunamis. These seem to me to be, we have to say that they are properties of God in some way,
Mm-hmm.
including all the bad things that ensue from these natural
Yeah.
events and not so natural events as well. What would he have to say about that?
Yeah, good. So the question that I would ask in return would be, why are those bad? Bad for whom? Right?
Mm,
That's what Spinoza is going to ask. And chances are, our answer is going to be, well, it's bad for us, and that's real, right? I'm not kind of I'm just kind of trying to speak in Spinoza's voice, right? I'm not undermining the tragedy that this natural phenomena can cause. But the fact that you call it natural phenomena, why are we attributing terms like good and evil, good and bad, to term like natural phenomena? Right? So Spinoza is going to say, saying that natural disasters are bad. It's just kind of like saying, if a rock drops off a roof when it gets blown by the wind and hits your head, and you're gonna say that it's bad. There's something bad that happened. This is the same thing, right? That's just a natural phenomenon that happens, right?
I see.
Nothing is gonna escape the natural world, including ourselves. So whatever notions of good and bad that we have, they are useful. We should keep them to some extent, right? They're very useful for several social phenomena. Psychologically, they are helpful. Um, but if you're gonna ask, do they correspond to anything real in a full sense? Spinoza is gonna say no.
Right. And insofar
And
as
not
we,
everybody is gonna be a fan of that. Yeah.
yeah, no, I agree. And if we move to like human beings causing murder or doing any acts that we ordinarily call abominable, we'll still have the same arguments that we are just machines that are determined in some way. And so it's not really
Mm,
bad for someone or something in an ordinary sense because that requires responsibility, which would be lacking in a view in which we are
yeah.
all just humanistic machines. I see. But he also posits that a substance cannot help but existing. And
Hmm.
if God is a substance, then it follows that God cannot help but existing in some ordinary sense or in some sense. This idea just seems it seems like God is also determined. It's a determined machine in a way that we
Hmm.
are. So in such
Yeah.
a way, by asserting that
Yeah.
like a substance cannot help but existing, he is asserting that it must
Hmm.
have a cause that sets it up into existence, even though that's contradictory to the definition
Hmm.
itself.
Yeah, I mean, this touches on a lot of things that we've been talking about. It touches on God as a creator and God as all loving, and the sense of natural phenomena, whether there are moral properties that could be ascribed to all these things. Um, well, I'm not sure where I could start, but one thing to say is that Spinoza's God is very much not anthropomorphic, so he's not a being who kind of thinks about what he wants to create and then
Mm,
decides to create. So if you're gonna think in terms of, this the world is fully determined or necessitated. Everything has been, the way we describe this, like all of us are machines, or the entirety of nature is kind of like a machine, right? It's really been programmed to run in only one way. It doesn't veer off. There's no deviation. I think that's exactly right. So, well, there's a question on the human part, but maybe we can focus on the God part first, right? So for God, think about the opposite case, right? If the world or the universe or nature wasn't behaving like this, did not behave like this, if the world could be another way, that seems to suggest that God could have chosen to do something else.
right.
So he could have chosen to intervene, maybe at some point, and change the course of events in nature, or he could have started out the whole world in a completely different series, could have constructed an entirely different world. Right, that brings in talk of possible worlds. It sounds like, God is someone who is thinking about multiple possibilities, just like we think about, oh, what do I want to eat? I have five options in my mind. Right? God has a bunch of options and he chooses to do this. Um, that's the kind of personal anthropomorphic God that Spinoza is very much wary of, right? For various reasons. We can get to that if you're interested. But one thing to say is that Spinoza's God doesn't think in that way. Right? Not that Spinoza's God doesn't think. Spinoza's God does have intellect, but you can't choose. Right? There's no sense in which there are other possible worlds. Right? The sense of perfection doesn't come from, choosing one world out of everything.
Mm,
The sense of perfection comes from activity, pure activity. There is no sense in which something was just potentially existing or anything like that. Everything just actually happens, whether now, in the future, or in the past. Right? So to suggest, that God could have done something else is to kind of like, to use the earlier comments to suggest maybe why did God, cause the tsunami?
mm,
He could have not caused the tsunami. Well, that would give us a different kind of God. He could give us a more loving God in some way,
mhm,
but
mm,
you're going to remove God from all his power of creation. And you're kind of saying that God could have done something else. And so, well, that ropes in a bunch of issues that, Spinoza is aware of and other theologians and philosophers are aware of. Well, then, does that mean that God made a mistake? Right? That seems to introduce, if anything, the lack of power, right?
right.
Or the lack of some kind of correct or full-blown intellect. It seems like he made the wrong decision. He could have changed his mind. He did not create correctly. And that brings in all sorts of troubles. It only makes sense. All these things only make sense if you think of God as kind of like existing in a very human way, making decisions as we do. And but Spinoza's God doesn't do that. As you say, it's a lot more like kind of it's just a machine that exists, from T0 to eternity. There's no sense of like change or choice at any point. Everything just flows.
Right. That is
Yeah.
an
And
interesting.
it's very hard to understand. Yeah. And one thing that Spinoza likes to say is like,
Mm,
which is really abstract. He says everything follows from God, just like the properties of a triangle follows from the nature of a triangle.
mm.
Yeah.
I see. I was just about to mention the alternative universes thing because he relies on that to at least to demonstrate that two substances cannot exist. He says, well, conceive of
Mm,
a world in which two substances exist, then they
mm,
must have certain attributes, and they must be distinct from each other. There's no such thing exists, and therefore there's just one substance that truly exists. He is against the idea that the world could be any possible way. Is he not committed to avoiding using counterfactuals, which is very popularly used in philosophies to establish certain points? If the world could not be any other way, then why even start conceiving that to make an argument?
Well, I don't think, using counterfactuals would suggest or necessarily implies a commitment to the existence of possibles, especially insofar as the counterfactual is used to show that there can only be one thing.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. If it showed otherwise, then maybe you would have something to criticize about Spinoza, and that would make sense, I think. And also, the way that we read conditionals as counterfactuals nowadays is not something quite available in Spinoza's time. So it's not always obvious that when Spinoza uses the terms, it's not clear that he means what we tend to mean nowadays when we talk about counterfactual.
Right.
But it could be. But in either case, if you kind of think that the whole argument, the first part of the ethics, you think it works logically, then it must follow that there can only be one substance. You
Right.
could distinguish a bunch of things within it. That's fine. Right? I'm still, in some sense, different from you. But there's just a bunch of atoms here and a bunch of atoms there, right? We are still just atoms,
Yes,
in the most basic sense.
I see. But he defines God as a free cause. What does he mean precisely by that?
Yeah. So I think, we kind of touched on this, but I guess it has to go back to what kind of notion of freedom are we working with?
Exactly.
Yeah, if we are working with the notion of freedom as being able to do otherwise, then that's not Spinoza's notion of freedom. Right? That's not something they can attribute to God, as for the reasons I've said previously. So his sense of freedom is very much to act out of necessity, of nature. And you might think that sounds contradictory. In a way, I think I can totally see it. You can kind of criticize Spinoza for kind of rewriting the terms, right? Such that it doesn't really resemble anything that looks like freedom, in a sense. But think about it another way, which is nothing has restrained God. Nothing has prevented God from doing otherwise,
Mm.
right? Uh, right. He didn't make a wrong choice, right? He didn't forget to do something. He didn't make a mistake, right? He didn't change his mind. So in that sense, he's acting out of his full absolute power.
Mm.
So he's, in a sense, fully correct, fully free. He did all of this, right? He could not have done otherwise, right? So there's only one path for him, right? So insofar as nothing caused him to do all that, he's free in that sense. So it's a very different notion of freedom from the one maybe we're used to nowadays. When we think of freedom, we think of something that could have gone down in another direction. We think about it as possible choices, possible alternatives. But Spinoza really doesn't think like that. And Spinoza is not the first person, but yeah,
Right.
he does take up that kind of
Mhm.
thought.
Okay, so just to step back and see what we've all done right now, we've established that there's a substance. There's one thing that is a substance that cannot help but existing, and this thing must have infinite attributes and essences.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
he uses the term God to describe this kind of thing.
yeah,
Uh, and then we have sort of had this intuition about it running through downstream. The
hmm.
idea that there is no free agents and all things are determined in some way. What are the implications of his view emerge from the ethics?
Yeah. So to start off from what you just said, right? So humans, well, basically, no entities in Spinoza's picture is gonna have anything like a free will. Right? To say that you have a free will is to say that you're self-sufficient in some way. There's a part of you that exists or that behaves independently of anything else. For
Mhm.
Spinoza, that just doesn't work because everything is going to be a part of God. Everything you can trace the causal arrows back to God eventually. You can trace it back to everything else and eventually back to God. And so we've been speaking mostly in terms of physical stuff because that's a little easier to understand. But for him, mental reality is like that as well. There is God in the mental sense. That's one of God's attributes. All our ideas, that's going to be just part of God's larger idea, however you want to think about that. Right? There's just this single idea of which every other idea is just a property. And that includes everything. Idea is kind of a general term, but it really includes things like volitions, includes feelings, includes our passions, includes all our ideas, all our representations. All of those are just parts of God, just like an atom is a part of God. So a free will that just doesn't really work in such a picture. Everything is causally connected up. So in there's a similar sense in which we find this in some Buddhist pictures as well. Right? Everything exists interdependently. Nothing exists in itself, really, in the full sense, except for God. So there is no free will. So that is kind of like the picture that we're working with. The implications of that, well, we have the usual worries, right, about moral responsibility and so on. I do not want to tie this too closely to the previous time we talked about the Buddhist materials, but some of these strategies are going to be somewhat similar. So certain notions of free will, we can use them and we should use them for everyday purposes. Uh, as long as we know that we're not actually making any stronger commitment to saying that
Right.
goodness exists in this pure, transcendent way as a form or something like that. We're not saying that, right? Moral properties, like goodness or badness of actions, um, they exist, but not really, right? They exist for us very much, right? That is a problem, right? It looks like, moral philosophy now that he's subscribing to some kind of moral relativism, subjectivism of various sorts. Some people are going to criticize him for being a moral nihilist. So he gets all the attacks that the Buddhists usually get. Yeah.
Yeah. So I always have a qualm with the idea that if morality is not objective and it's relative in some sense, then it sort of undermines it. But it seems to me that there are many such concepts that we have that we know don't objectively exist in such a way that if we can conceive of some other world, those things must necessarily exist as well. But we find them useful nonetheless, like the concept of citizenship and the concept
Hmm.
laws and all of these things. Like the idea that for some reason if morality is relative, then everything comes to shams and we cannot make sense
Mm.
of our moral case. We could just abide the bullet and say that they are useful things that make us act successfully in the world, and for that reason and for that reason alone, we ought to follow it. And I mean, we could also, just because a domain is relative does not mean that there are certain elements within it that could be objective. So we could say that, well, at the end, what we all agree on as being good and bad may be in some sense relative, but the things that follow, so if we all agree that not being stabbed in the back is good for our accomplishing of tasks like making money and educating ourselves, then it follows that we ought to avoid or imprison people who do such an act. So it seems like there is some objective fact about living that has been derived from some relative thing or action that we've all agreed on. What do you think about that kind of
Yeah,
point?
I think that's kind of a nice kind of middle path to use the very Buddhist stuff. It's kind of a nice middle way in trying to like avoid trying to say that moral properties or moral phenomena exist in some kind of strong, pure sense, transcendental sense. And also you're trying to avoid the other extremes. Just say, oh, everything's just arbitrarily decided, everything's just subjective, nothing matters. Right. So your solution is a nice one. Spinoza might not say exactly something like that, but he's gonna agree with you that, so on the two ends, you have objective and subjective. I think what you're describing is something like intersubjective agreement,
Mm,
something in the middle, right? So yeah, it doesn't correspond to anything out there, but it's helpful, right? Just like, and this might be too strong, but like, just like, we have all sorts of definitions for physical things, right? We have a definition of a table, we have a definition of a chair. Those can change. We know those can change. Those are completely fluid. They're quite vague. If I define a table as, or if I define a chair as something that has four legs, is flat, something that people sit on, well, I can sit on my four-legged flat table, and that becomes a chair, right? There are all sorts of things that we realize at bottom that they don't correspond to anything out there, but we can just kind of agree to that insofar as we need each other. And I think that's a big part of Spinoza's picture that you don't get in Buddhist philosophy. And it's not obviously so. Um, Spinoza in his later works is very keen on emphasizing the interdependence of human beings.
mm,
So even though it sounds like he's a moral subjectivist, his conclusion is not, okay, let's just kind of make our own rules and do whatever we want. He actually thinks, there are a lot of problems that plague us, right? We are affected by all sorts of prejudices, all sorts of conflict. We really need to work together. We need to adopt some of these notions. We need to clarify them, improve upon them, realize that our notions of good and evil do not latch onto something out there objectively. But there's still a sense in which there's a better and worse conceptual schema to work with, even if they're arbitrary in some sense. So that's gonna be the approach they take, and it's gonna really involve other people.
Right. Would Spinoza's view that follows from this lack of freedom, that should we act as though free will does exist? Should we continue living with this illusion? Because it seems to me that, for example, I think it's particularly useful because imagine I don't know, going to work on some project that I'm going to, well, I'm living in society and I decide to do something horrendous. And I blame that on the lack of volition. It
Mhm.
seems to me that society ought to still operate in the way it does, currently does, because precisely because I do not have free will, if there is some law that says that we ought not do X, otherwise we'll be remanded, then in some way, because I'm not in control of whether or not I could make my mind move to doing this act, even regardless, the fact that this law has some impression in my mind such that I'm unable to act in some way makes for a useful society. Would he
Mhm.
want us to be committed to living as though we have no free will, whatever that means,
Mhm.
or to
Mhm.
live under this?
Yeah.
Does he commit us to living this argument to its fullest truth?
Yeah, so this is one of the areas in which I think you could find potentially more than one answer in Spinoza. He kind of has kind of an answer for the pure philosopher, the pure rationalist. So that person is going to realize that there is no free will, and that person might be okay with it. I'm not sure exactly what Spinoza thinks his person is, or whether he even thinks such a person can exist. But for the rest of us, which is almost everybody, it's kind of impossible to actually live thinking that free will doesn't exist. Right? I can have that thought. I can read Spinoza and agree. Yeah, I agree with the argument. It's very compelling. I don't have free will. But to actually live as if you're not directed by yourself, that's really weird. I don't think Spinoza is gonna suggest that we can do away with that.
Mm,
The psychology of how we think, he's gonna call these our emotions, our affects, and the way we interact with things, all sorts of ideas that we get, all kind of conceptions and preconceptions, prejudices that we get. We can never truly be free of from all of them. The best we can do is to kind of clarify them, uh,
mm,
crystallize them, improve upon them. Um, it'd be nice if everybody gets as close as possible to what the pure philosopher or the pure rationalist sees, which is that there is absolutely no free will at all. But until then, until such a time, everybody realizes that all at once. Everyone else doesn't realize that, right? So it doesn't really make sense to just tell people that you don't have free will. That is definitely not his practical project. His practical project is a lot more about kind of understanding your emotions, where they come from, right? And you can kind of like understand this in much more contemporary terms, right? It's just very much, well, I did something. What led to that? Right? How much of it was me?
mm.
And how much of it was something else? Then we kind of learn to kind of attribute and identify all of these causes and conditions that led to me doing some good act or bad act, whatever it is. How much of it contributed to this was outside of me, so to speak. If a lot of these causes that led to me breaking a window, a lot of it seemed to lie outside of me. Right? The most extreme case is obviously if somebody actually forced me to do it, right,
Right.
at gunpoint. Right? Well, you can pretty easily draw the causal direction and say, oh, that was the cause of it.
Mm,
But if you have a different picture and it looks like the most of the cause or the primary causes lie somewhere within my intentions, then maybe we can say something like, well, I'm responsible.
right.
But again, that doesn't mean that we have free will. Uh, Whatever that led to me having those intentions, there's a whole range of causes feeding into the intention as well. It resulted in that intention. And you can keep drawing the causal story. Um, Nobody can at any one point in time come up with the whole causal story of the entire universe because I am connected to everything.
Mm.
To give a causal story for my existence and even one action that I do is going to involve everything in the world. That's just impossible on the face of it. So I
Right.
think Spinoza does recognize the limitations of it, right? He's not trying to suggest that all of us just stop thinking and just realize that we're automatons or necessarily determined or anything like that. Yeah.
So Spinoza's the ethics is made up of like definitions, axioms, propositions, conclusions, all of that.
Hmm.
I think it's what we call non-ampliative sort of arguments
Mm.
that necessarily follow if you agree with all of the propositions and axioms that come
Yeah.
about. A critique to like modern philosophy that I've heard around in this
Mm.
cultural times is that like these kinds of things don't give us meaning, for example, or they don't make life purposeful. So imagine the kind
Mm.
of setting that we have is that we have this individual that is walking towards a bridge and they're attempting to throw themselves off that bridge. And then we have on one hand a philosopher that comes and says that look at this syllogism, like S therefore
Yeah.
T. So you shouldn't
Yeah.
where T here the conclusion that you ought not throw yourself
Mm.
from the build, maybe giving their desires, the kinds of things that they want to achieve and maximize. If we give them this formal argument that S then T, S therefore T, they will be as convinced as when they started. But however, if you have on this other hand, some other person who is not a philosopher comes around and says, "Look, they recite a poem by I don't know Keats when I have fears," or tell them about their personal experience about how life has been a struggle, but they've emerged from that
Mm.
struggle. We have a distinction between the kinds of, I guess, argumentation, if you'd like, that
Yeah.
provides one meaning that can move people's mind towards certain conclusions more effectively than
Yeah.
others.
Yeah.
Why, first of all, you probably are not,
Yeah.
but why is it the case that we cannot be moved by pure argumentation?
Yeah.
But then there are some other forms of argument that seem to work as well, or even more so. Uh,
Hmm.
and should we, as philosophers, or I guess philosophy enthusiasts, be moving towards one direction or another in terms of convincing other people of certain conclusion that we think necessarily follows?
Hmm. Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, there's a lot of things to be said about that. So one thing, and I'll try to keep track. One thing we could say is Spinoza actually recognizes that. So as I said in my earlier response, sometimes some people think that across Spinoza's writings, he actually kind of offers different answers as to how to live a good life. Not all of it is gonna resemble what we see in the ethics, which is, you might think as kind of a geometrical proof, syllogistic reasoning, non-imperative reasoning. It looks as if, oh, we just need to start with the right definitions and axioms, and we can get everything else. And you know, that's the end of the story. But elsewhere, he actually thinks that in his political works and in the second half of the ethics, some people think actually Spinoza really realizes the power of other means of orienting the mind. That is not just rational. So big part of Spinoza's psychology or his philosophy of mind has to do with the division between rational and non-rational means. So the non-rational means are like affective or emotional. They're not fully rational, but he actually thinks those are very powerful. So he's gonna agree with you, right? So in some situations, it looks like the light of pure reason actually doesn't really help in some situations. I think Spinoza will happily accept that.
Hmm.
And insofar as it's kind of a impossible ideal to think that everyone could just be like a philosopher, it doesn't actually vouch for such a society. His society is actually one in which, well, at least this is just one interpretation, but his society that he really wants is one in which he prizes not truth, actually, but freedom of thought and peace. He thinks those two things come together. Right? So, and he thinks, it's not necessary that he's not actually asking everyone to learn his philosophy, and that's not his ideal. Someone like Descartes actually thought that, he actually wanted universities to teach his philosophy. Spinoza didn't actually say that. Maybe he wanted, I'm not sure. But the political society he envisioned, or the society he envisioned, really wasn't like that. Right? It wasn't the kind of, it wasn't ruled by philosopher king. Hopefully, they are wise in some sense, but they're not philosophers. So there's a role to be played by non-rational means. The affects, feelings, emotions, the imagination, right? Fictions, right? Narratives, stories, all of those devices, they play some kind of role, right? So again, to go back to some of the things we talked about, free will, um, it's great if everybody just accepts that, and realizes that there's no free will, but it's actually still pretty useful to keep some sense in which moral responsibility is helpful. It keeps us, in line in some ways, where it keeps society from erupting in chaos. And that's, part of the picture that Spinoza is emerging from. He's emerging from a time of political and civic unrest. So he actually has a lot of these targets in mind. So that's kind of one thing that I would say. there's more to be said about how he understands these non-rational devices to work, but there it is there in his philosophy. The second thing to note is that even in the ethics that we just read, you'll notice that he actually adopts different voices.
He
So
does. Yeah.
not everything is in the quote unquote geometrical voice. He doesn't do everything using the geometrical proofs. He offers multiple explanations. In the geometrical proofs, he doesn't use the first person at all. He doesn't refer to anybody. Right? He's kind of abstract, clinical, mechanical. But every now and then, he's just gonna insert his own voice and say, these people got it wrong. Right? Let me explain why in simpler terms. And let me explain by referring to things that people know nowadays, right? To events that people know nowadays. And so he actually adopts different voices. He realized, I think on some levels, Spinoza knows that if he cut out all those parts and just left the pure reasoning stuff there, it might not have worked out quite as well. Yeah. So he actually devotes a lot of things in prose, and he explains things like, look at how silly people are when all their prejudices, and let me try to convince you. But
Right.
technically, he has already made a case earlier on,
Exactly.
right? But he feels the need to do it anyway. And so that says something about so even though Spinoza is kind of seen as the uber rationalist, there's plenty of reason to think that he actually isn't.
Well, even though I made that claim, I am most moved by what seems to me to be arguments. So the things that have the most
Mm,
impression on me are formal arguments. And we spoke about this quite briefly sometime, but I think there's something about some aesthetic impression that I get from just reading it,
mm,
even if I don't ultimately agree with it. So for
yeah.
example, I remember the first time we studied conservative extensions and that will
Mm,
we have that finitary mathematics is straightforwardly
yeah.
legitimate. Infinite
Yeah.
mathematics is not so straightforwardly legitimate, and we can think
Yeah.
of infinite mathematics as being legitimate insofar as it's a conservative extension of finitary mathematics, such that we are just saying that infinite mathematics is a shorthanded way of arriving towards the conclusion that finitary mathematics brings us to. Like something like that, like it draws
Mm,
my attention, my mind to the conclusion
yeah.
just
Yeah.
from first glance, just from seeing the
Yeah.
beauty of the representation
Yeah.
of the argument itself. So
Yeah.
I would actually argue that for me, the most impressionable thing are arguments. And I wonder that for the people that are on the other side of the camp that say that, well, no, it's not all of these syllogisms that convince me of anything or that give my life meaning or from which I can derive meaning. It's really impressions from poetry and prose and
Hmm.
storytelling. I just fear that it's just because when an argument is presented to them, they don't actually understand what the argument entails. I feel like everybody who truly understands an argument and its conclusions must
Yeah.
be in some way moved to the conclusion
Yeah.
by necessity.
Yeah.
What do you think
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I see where you're coming from. And I think, there are people who are very drawn to Spinoza or thinkers like Spinoza, or even just philosophy in general, like precisely for that reason. But there are also philosophers and non-philosophers who are like, absolutely, they really think that, whatever, we think is important, truth, meaning, value, all those terms, it doesn't lie in syllogistic reasoning.
Mm.
I think to some extent, my response would just be, I'm just gonna take whatever I can from both sides, right?
Yeah.
So there are gonna be logic is fun and it's in a way very pure. Like when I do logical deductions and proofs, or I do geometry, do proofs and math. It's really nice to just be able to work with simple starting points and get the right quote unquote the right answer. You can derive everything else. Right? So that's a part of the appeal. I think most people agree with that.
Mm.
But you know, going from the Pythagoras theorem to reasoning about moral phenomena or psychological phenomena or the goodness of the world. Well, there's a lot of steps in between. Between accepting the basic kind of mathematical and geometrical truths and accepting much more complicated nuanced things about our society, about ourselves, about our minds. Right? And a lot of those terms, part of the difficulty is that a lot of these terms say good and evil, God, free will, the human mind, all of those terms are quite unlike mathematical objects or geometrical objects. Mathematical objects, geometrical objects, we kind of have an understanding of that. Nobody's really disagreeing even about the definitions. But in all those other terms that philosophy is concerned with, nobody has come to an agreement about almost any of these topics. People still disagree about how we should understand things. Um, yeah, so I guess that's kind of a non-response, but that's one way to kind of start to think about what's happening here. But I think more substantively, Spinoza and a lot of European thinkers, they are drawing from a tradition where mathematics, geometry, those disciplines, um, they kind of have this pure status. Right? They're at the very top of the hierarchy of knowledge for a lot of them. This goes back all the way to Plato, this goes back all the way to Euclid, and there is something elegant and beautiful in the way in which you can literally, not look at anything, you can close your eyes, you can just think of these proofs, and they work. Right? I wouldn't say it's magical, right? But it's intuitive, right? It's immediate. And
Mm.
so that has always been the gold standard, right? Obviously, nowadays we have complicated things. There's non-Euclidean proofs. We realize that all sorts of logical systems, are undergirded by all sorts of assumptions and so on and so forth. But the bulk of it is such that it works immediately, and people have gravitated towards it. So whenever people talk about math and geometry and philosophy, chances are it's always the paradigm of knowledge. Everything else, in our moral situations, metaphysical situations like God, free will, we always strive for that. So
Right.
I think that's what Spinoza is trying to do.
Mm.
Uh, for some people, that for you, maybe you found it to be on a par of what Spinoza is trying to do. Maybe he's on a par with Euclid, maybe not. Most people are going to say probably not, but he's trying, right? Precisely because he wants us to realize these kind of truths that
Mm.
hopefully we can intuit, just like we intuit truths about triangles and circles.
Right.
We do not need an actually existing triangle to perform all it. We just need
Mm.
to think it. Yeah, there's something nice about it.
What about you? Do you find some aesthetic joy in reading an argument? For example, I remember when we have like these readings from uh, Philosophy 233, and actually this is the
Yeah.
first time it did genuinely did not feel like learning. It didn't, it was hard
Mm.
material. But I would find myself like holding my iPad in my hand and reading the arguments from what we learned in class. And it's just joy. I'm not like, I have to do this. And honestly, it was the first time I felt such a thing. It was so powerful and influenced that I was like, I
Yeah.
have to take as many philosophy courses before I graduate. So I wonder if that happens to you as well.
Yeah. I have to think about it. Well, so first of all, I have to say, I envy, your experience, your kind of like encounter with philosophy. I'm glad it worked out like that for you. For me, I'm not sure it quite worked out that way. So I do enjoy, back when I was doing like formal logic. Even before that, I was a science student.
Mm,
I very much enjoyed pure mathematics and physics. I hated, biology. I hated applied mathematics. I hated statistics. I really like pure stuff. So maybe some of that carried on
mm,
philosophy. But I think, uh, I mean, I'm still quite young in a sense of being a philosopher. But at my stage, at my current stage, I feel like syllogistic reasoning only goes so far, or at least there's a lot to be said before we even get to the step of syllogistic reasoning. And there's so many assumptions about our terminology. There's so many cultural, maybe sometimes non-cultural, just theoretical assumptions that we make when we use all of these terms. That plays a role. And I think that's something important that philosophy can deal with. So philosophy can deal with the pure stuff, the logical arguments, but it can deal with a lot of the messy stuff as well, to some extent. Not,
right.
but I'm definitely not someone who thinks that philosophy can solve all problems. Some people think that, some people really think that, but I do not think that. So my experience is a little bit more tempered.
Right.
Um, but I do get it. I know what I mean. Like sometimes just reading something really elegant and
Right.
it just works. It just is true. But unfortunately, that kind of experience is really rare, right?
Right.
Especially as you get deeper and deeper into philosophy.
Mm,
So many arguments have counterexamples. So many arguments have objections and replies and further objections, and you can keep going. Um, that's in another sense. That's also the fun of it. So some people think that the fact that you can just start with some premises and arrive nicely at a conclusion, that's really elegant and that's really kind of fun mentally. Other people think that the fact that you can keep this dialectic going, the
mm.
fact that we have a never-ending debate
Uh-huh.
back and forth, that's actually more fun than just kind of arriving at a certain truth. Maybe.
That is true. C.S. Lewis famously defined the thing that is meaningful. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's C.S. Lewis, or he defines it
Mhm.
as something that we sort of have in our mind that we could achieve. Like in this case, would be the idea that we can come to some ultimate truth of reality,
Mhm.
and it keeping itself elusive from us, which is the forever chain of argumentation that happens
Yeah.
generations and generations of philosophers. But I would say I agree with you that perhaps this excitement towards the philosophy itself is
Mhm.
governed by the confound that I'm not a
Yeah.
philosopher myself, and I don't do this, and I don't have to
Yeah.
look at all the arguments on a daily basis as you do, presumably. So that's probably on the table still. But
Mhm.
to end our conversation, I just wanted to ask, well, does Spinoza have any prescription of how we should relate ourselves to this one true substance that he calls God?
Mhm. Right. Yeah, this is a good note to end on. So ultimately, part of his answer is a whole package, but part of his answer is gonna be real realizing all the truths that he's been trying to argue for, he's been trying to convince you about your human mind, about your human body, how everything is a part of this wider infinite causal network. At the same time, to realize that you are caused by everything else and also by God. So to realize, so this is kind of my reading of it, right? So that kind of understanding is actually to kind of realize that you're not yourself. There's
Mm,
not much to you. There's intrinsically or inherently, to use those terms, there's intrinsically you, right? In isolation from everything else. So
right.
that's kind of part of the conclusion I think Spinoza wants us to arrive at. Some people take issue with this for similar reasons why people take issue with Buddhist philosophy. You're kind of undercutting the sense of self. But I think there are many healthy ways to view it, right? It's not an annihilation or negation of the self, but really it's just kind of realization of your interconnectedness with everything else. I think that's part of the picture.
It
And
is.
here's kind of like really specific, I think 4 to 5 remedies for how to kind of make yourself a little bit more free. You can never be purely free. The only thing that can be purely free is God, definitely. But he does think, there are some practices, certain things they can do, that will move you from a state of less freedom to more freedom.
Mm,
You can't escape the causal network, but gaining knowledge, say, gaining knowledge about, how the food and drinks that I consume affect my daily habit, my daily energy. That does something. That piece of knowledge tells me how my mental and bodily life is going to be affected. And I can do something about that. I can't do everything. I can't change the world entirely to make myself fully free. But it's kind of a very simple example to think about how you can improve in your kind of progress from a state of less freedom to more freedom. Obviously, the information about the nutrition of food and drinks, that's kind of like a low bar, but he thinks there are more complicated cases. For example, more psychological phenomena, right? Think about why you're angry.
mm,
And well, it's the same story. You start to trace your causes. Right? If you've identified the causes, you can say something about the causes. You've realized that, well, actually, it doesn't really make sense for me to be angry at that or for that reason. Just like it doesn't make sense for me to be angry, at a rock falling on my head in the middle of the day.
right.
So there are ways to kind of manage your psychological and physical self. Um, and eventually, to realize your interconnectedness with everything. But before that, all these remedies are gonna help you on your way. Yeah.
I think that's a beautiful note to end. The fact that we are all interconnected as a reading of Spinoza's work, and I guess Carl Sagan does this really nicely when he says that we are all stardust, and
Hmm.
simply try
Yeah.
to point us to the fact that we all have one origin and we're all
Yeah.
modes of whatever
Yeah.
substance exists. Thank you so much, Vincent. This has been
No
exciting.
problem.
I can't wait for the next conversation, whatever that may be. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.